It's time for the Kim Hammer Show, where you'll learn how your state government affects you, your family, and community. Here's Kim Hammer.
Good afternoon. Glad to have you joining us on the Kim Hammer Show this afternoon. And John, I got a lot of feedback in here for some reason. But anyway, glad to have you on the Kim Hammer Show this afternoon. We've got quite a full hour lined up, actually. We've got Representative Jimmy Gazaway is going to be joining me here in just a minute. We're going to be talking about Senate Bill 379 and Senate Bill 378. These are bills that are going to deal with the emergency powers here in the state of Arkansas. And then I'm going to be joined by State Representative Carlton Wing. He is going to be speaking about some legislation that I picked up on dealing with protecting senior adults from fraud and some of the fraudulent activity that's going on. And then we'll finish out the hour with John Vincent, who is the president of the Pharmacists Association here in Arkansas, as well as John Martin, the owner of the Bryant Family Pharmacy. And we're going to talk about the vaccine progress that we're making. They've got some new news to add when they get on the show toward the end of it. Also talking about the new vaccine that's coming out from Johnson & Johnson, and we'll talk about it for the rest of the hour. Right now, though, joined by State Representative Jimmy Gazaway. Jimmy, thank you for taking time out on Saturday to join me here on the Kim Hammer Show.
Hey, Kim, sure, absolutely. Happy to be here.
Just so the folks have some familiarity, why don't you tell them which district it is that you represent and the geographical areas you represent?
Sure, I represent District 57, which is up in northeast Arkansas, and that's just a part of Greene County, primarily the city of Paragould and the city of Oak Grove Heights.
Very good. One thing I always think about Paragould is there's a place, I think it's called the Iron Horse, out north of town. Great little place to eat, kind of a hole-in-the-wall place out there. They've got some really good steaks, and when you drive by it, you would think that's not the place you want to eat, but really it is the place you want to eat. So if you're up in that area, you might stop at it. Jimmy, we've worked together.
Barbecue. Good barbecue there.
Yep, great barbecue. In fact, a lot of bikers stop there to eat. So Senate Bill 379 and 378. You and I have been working on this for, 4 months now?
It's been quite the project, several months for sure.
And so what we wanted to do is together, and I'm going to just kind of play as though I didn't have anything to do with this bill and ask you some questions. We're going to move through it. If you want to see the copy of the bill, you can go up to www.arcleg.ar.us. That's www.arkleg.ar.us. And when you pull up that website, that's going to be the legislative website, and you'll find a place where you can enter a bill number. If you type in the bill number, which is SB379, just the letters SB379, and click on it, it'll pull up a PDF file. You can open it. You can follow along with us if you want, because what this bill does is it works toward bringing back some of the balance with regards to the exercising of the emergency powers here in the state of Arkansas. And one thing that, Jimmy, I think you and I would agree on, this is, and nobody should misunderstand this either, this is not at all a direct attack toward the current legislation necessarily, or toward the governor specifically. This is just a recognition and a response to a recognition for what we've been going through for the last year, that there's some balances that we need to bring back into the picture with regards to how we as a legislative branch are involved whenever there's a declaration of emergency. Is that a pretty fair scenario or explanation?
Absolutely. I think really the purpose of this legislation is to empower the legislature, where previously under the Emergency Services Act of 1973, the legislature was not empowered to really act at all during an emergency. And so the legislature, being the people's branch of government, this restores a proper balance of power and inserts the legislature so that we can exercise our constitutional role and be the people's voice, even in the event of an emergency.
And one thing that we need to point out is that, as with all legislation, you pass it and then you get a real life situation where it gets tested, and you might want to come back during the next session and make the adjustments to, because it's always a balancing act. It's kind of like a set of scales. You put a weight on one side and you got to put a set on the other side, and it's just always a constant effort to try to keep that balance. So I don't think anybody should interpret our efforts as either an attack or an implication that what is in place now is necessarily wrong. It's just that we've recognized that we could make it better. With that being said, the bill is actually broken into sections. And Jimmy, you're an attorney, so why don't you talk a little bit just so folks understand how a bill is drafted, and when it talks about the sections that are mentioned in there, what's the intent of the design of the crafting of a bill with regards to having various sections in there?
Well, we address several issues in this bill, and there are different pieces of different statutes that are addressed in each section. So with the first section, you really just have the legislative intent, which is where we set out why we're drafting this bill or why we're introducing this bill in the first place. What is our intent? What do we propose to accomplish with this bill? And so you'll see that set out in Section 1. Section 2, of course, in this particular bill, is where we amend the Emergency Services Act, particularly with regard to the declaration of emergencies, how those are declared, and then how the General Assembly has the ability to come in and terminate a declaration of disaster emergency. You move on. Section 3 in this bill deals with the governor's ability to control ingress and egress out of the state. And of course, we needed to make, at the request of some members, a specific statement that the governor can't stop legislators from meeting at the seat of government to do their constitutional duty. Section 4 is where we still addressing the Emergency Services Act and amending that, talk about if the governor seeks to renew a statewide state of disaster emergency, the process for that. Section 5 is where we deal with the Board of Health and their emergency powers and their ability to operate during an emergency. Section 6 is temporary language, and so, we have several sections in this bill of temporary language that addresses the current emergency that we're in. And so those other sections really address going forward when there's a declaration of disaster emergency, how we deal with those. But then there are a couple of sections of temporary language that deal with the present emergency that we're in. Those are sections 6 and 7. And then we have a severability clause, which section 8, which says if any part of this bill would be declared unconstitutional, it doesn't affect the overall bill, and the other sections remain in place. And then section 9, the emergency clause, which is an emergency exists, and when we pass this bill and the governor signs it, or if the governor doesn't sign it, after a certain number of days, it goes into effect immediately because we need to operate quickly. So I think that's kind of what all the sections do and how you can kind of break down this piece of legislation.
Okay, kind of like eating the elephant one bite at a time. So first section deals with what you mentioned as far as legislative intent. And, sometimes after legislation is passed and we adjourn and we're out of here, and maybe later on a piece of legislation is challenged in court, or somebody wants to go back and change or address what a piece of legislation is, intent is a pretty weighty aspect of what a piece of legislation evolves around or revolves around, because the intent speaks to what we as legislators wanted to see the piece of legislation achieve with regard. And, intent is usually at the beginning of each piece of legislation that is drafted. What is the purpose of the intent in Section 1 as it relates to what this bill is intended to do?
Well, I think it's very clear. We wanted to set up an appropriate check and balance. That's our system of government operates on a system of checks and balances. And under the previous Emergency Services Act, or the current Emergency Services Act, I guess I should say, we haven't technically amended it yet, the executive has all the power, and the legislature really didn't have an opportunity to serve as an appropriate check on that executive power. And so that's why we saw, many of our constituents contacted their members of the legislature. I know I heard from several of my constituents, I know you probably did too, about what was going on, why all of these directives were in place. And they really kind of blamed the legislature. And, what I had to tell them, which is probably what I'm sure you told your constituents, is I didn't have anything to do with this. I haven't had any say in this. The legislature has not met regarding any of these things. These have all come from the executive branch. And so, really the intent of this legislation is to allow the legislature to serve as an appropriate check on the executive power and for us to fulfill our constitutional duty, which is to represent the people's voice in government.
Going on to Section 2, and if you got the copy of the bill in front of you on Section 2, which is page 2, also down to line 25, it says statewide state of disaster emergency related to a public health. One of the things that we are trying to do in this bill, and as you mentioned, we are actually taking on 3 or 4 different issues within one bill because they were hard to separate from each other. We're dealing with the executive declaration of emergency, but we're also dealing with the Board of Health directives, and then we're dealing also with how we're going to address things moving forward in the future once this one is behind us. But we've got to take care of what's here now because, as mentioned, the governor is going to extend the emergency not for 60 days this time, but only for 30 days. And I think some of that's so that legislation can get pushed through because we have seen some beneficial things as a result of the emergency order that we've been able to do and agencies have been able to do. We want to be able to retain that, but we need permanent legislation to be able to do that. On page 2, down line 25 through 28, that specific paragraph mentions that the emergency can only last for 60 days, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then you move on down to the next one, talking about including without limitation a statewide state of disaster emergency related to public health. The one thing that we wanted to get crafted into this legislation was that if a statewide state of emergency is declared, that it would have to be identified as a public health emergency because there are different kind of emergencies that can be declared, but this one is related to public health. Anything to share on that one?
Yeah, and one thing that I think you see in the early part of this bill, which is really one of the most important pieces of the bill, the bottom of page 2 and the top of page 3, is where the legislature retains the ability to terminate a state of disaster emergency declared by the governor at any time. And that includes any state of disaster emergency that the governor may declare, whether that's on a statewide basis or not. And we can meet at any time, whether we're in session, in fiscal session, in an extraordinary session, or whether we're out of session. The legislature can convene itself for the purpose of terminating an emergency. And that was the situation that we found ourselves in during this present emergency, was that we could terminate a state of disaster emergency by concurrent resolution passed by both houses of the legislature, but we weren't in session. And there was a bit of question as, we can't call ourselves into session. And at that point, many people were of the belief that the only way we could get together to pass that concurrent resolution was if the governor called us into a special session. And the governor, never did call us into a special session. And so the legislature was basically helpless to be able to terminate that emergency. So we have made it, from the outset, that any disaster emergency that the governor may declare in the future, whether that's a statewide basis or just a localized emergency, if the legislature wants to meet to terminate it, the legislature can, and that includes whether we're in session or out of session.
And that is the one thing back on line 25 through 28 also is that in order for an initial emergency to continue beyond 60 days, it is going to have to be reviewed by the legislative council, and there would have to be a vote to terminate it. There'll have to be some effort on the part of the legislative branch, and that is one thing that, some members had advocated pretty strongly, is that if the governor has to make tough decisions, then the legislative branch ought to have to make tough decisions too. And so it is incumbent upon us as a legislative branch that we would have to vote to terminate the emergency, but it couldn't continue for longer than 60 days before it comes back before legislative council. On page 2 through 3, where you're referring to, A couple things that we wrote into this bill was that it would be up to the Speaker of the House and also to the pro tem of the Senate to call us into a meeting of the whole for the purpose of a concurrent resolution. But one thing, and one thing we want people to understand is we're not just trying to write a piece of legislation as it relates to what we're dealing with now. We were trying to, and members, gave us insight to this. We are trying to look at what if it's 20 or 30 years down the road, when it's a different governor, or maybe it's a different generation of legislators. What would we want to see happen 20 or 30 years down the road? So we actually have written in there that should the pro tem or should the Speaker of the House not be willing to call the legislative branch into it, say, for example, one of them is favorable toward the governor and doesn't want to bring us in, this would give the membership the ability to override leadership in order to get us into a meeting of the whole for the purpose of a concurrent resolution. 51 members of the House could sign a letter, 18 members of the Senate could sign a letter, and that would force us to come in. Jimmy, anything I missed out on that?
No, that's exactly correct. I think that's a very important piece of the legislation.
When we started this discussion, Representative Gazaway had taken a real strong look at what they did in Georgia. And as we see other parts of the nation struggling with the same issue, this is kind of a simulation of all of what other states have done in response to what they've recognized as well to bring the balance of the power. That was a component picked up from another state. On page 3, lines 16 through 31, if the General Assembly enacts a concurrent resolution terminating the emergency under this subsection or subdivision of the section, the state of disaster emergency shall terminate on the date of which the state of disaster emergency will expire as provided in the executive order or proclamation during the state of disaster emergency unless a concurrent resolution provides for an earlier termination. Why don't you talk about that and what the rationale was behind why we put that language in there?
Right. We wanted to set it up so that if we came in to vote and voted to terminate the disaster emergency, that it would terminate on the date that it was set to expire unless the General Assembly set an earlier date. So it can't go beyond the date that it's set to expire, but the General Assembly could terminate it at an earlier date from the date that it was already set to expire. And then in the next section, what you see was part of that discussion about the concurrent resolution was that the governor technically has to sign a concurrent resolution. And so even if both chambers met, the House and the Senate passed the concurrent resolution to terminate the emergency and it made it to the governor's desk, the governor probably wouldn't sign it. And so we wrote in the very next section, much like with a bill, if the governor doesn't sign a bill or if a governor vetoes a bill, then the legislature has the ability to override a veto. And so same thing with this current concurrent resolution to terminate an emergency. This is in the next section, of course. If we pass a concurrent resolution to terminate the emergency, we send it to the governor refuses to sign it, then within 5 days, it comes back to us. We can vote for a repassage, and that has the effect of overriding the governor's failure to approve the resolution. And so, again, appropriate checks and balances there along the way.
Well, and it was pretty well crafted as to what we're used to dealing with. And so, yes, just like what we would call a regular piece of legislation that has the full effect of the law, we want the ability that if the governor chose, as you said, not to sign the concurrent resolution or to veto it, we could at least come in and override that veto, because for us to come in, we feel that we have a good reason for that at the time. Moving on to page 4, lines 8 through 11, talks about the disaster having to be declared as a public health, including without limitation. It goes through one of the things that we wanted to get worked into this piece of legislation was that if there's a statewide emergency that is declared, and it was going to be declared for the purposes or the justification of public health, that would have to be included in the declaration. Am I remembering that right?
Yes.
And then when you go on down to lines 24 through 27, talks about the governor shall declare statewide disaster emergency related to it. And and this is a piece of language. We kind of looked at it down the road. What if we saw a governor, what if you saw a governor like out in New York, that was just trying to take control of the state, but he wasn't trying to take control of it all at one time. It was just kind of adding in as he goes. One of the things we wanted to get in on page 4 through page 5 is to kind of set the basis for what determines a statewide state of emergency for the state, because you put together certain population centers in the state and you could rise to a high level very quickly. So explain why it is that we put in there the 19 counties or the 25% of the population.
Yeah, basically exactly like what you said. I mean, part of what we had to do in drafting this legislation was think to the future. If we had a governor who was trying to use an emergency to take over the state, for whatever purposes that may be, it's kind of an odd thing to have to think about a rogue governor or like a maniacal governor that would want to do this sort of thing. But, these are the things that you have to think about. If you don't make it clear about what a statewide state of disaster emergency is, the governor could declare, for example, every county in the state but one a disaster emergency and then claim that it's not statewide. And so since we were drafting the bill for purposes of dealing with a large-scale emergency, we basically defined statewide as being 19 or more counties, which is 25% of the total number of counties, or if 25% of the overall population is affected by the emergency declaration or the restrictions, et cetera, then that will constitute a statewide state of disaster emergency, which will trigger the legislature being involved in the decision-making process. We didn't, and there's a balance there. We want to make sure that the governor has the flexibility that they need to respond quickly and to deal with localized emergencies. There's probably not a need to call the legislature in to deal with a tornado in Jonesboro, for instance. That doesn't affect the entire state. It just affects a very small local area. But when you start talking about 19 counties or more, or 25% of the overall affected population, then you need to start bringing the legislature and the people's branch of government in to be involved in those decisions. And so that's why we wrote it that way.
All right. And then when you move on to page 5, it kind of gets into business so the emergency has been declared. It's this particular emergency, of which we're dealing with multiple types of emergencies that can be declared. The one thing is we've got a termination switch in this that regardless of whatever emergency is declared, whether it's a statewide declaration of emergency for public health reasons, it's a statewide emergency for reasons other than a public health emergency, that we have the ability, or we are actually required as a legislative branch on the top of page 5, that we have to come in within 8 business days to concur with the emergency and vote to terminate it if we don't agree with it. Talk about the rationale behind 8 days, because you started that conversation when you were looking at the Georgia bill. So talk about the rationale of it for a minute.
Right. This is a real important piece to the members of the legislature, because basically this guarantees that the legislature and the entire legislature is going to get a say on the issue when there is a statewide state of disaster emergency declared. And so, we looked at what other states had done. If you look at Georgia's emergency services law, if there's a public health emergency in Georgia, the governor declares it, and the legislature is required by law there to meet within 2 days. And we saw that actually happen under the COVID-19 emergency. The Georgia legislature came in and met within 48 hours to approve or to terminate the emergency. Obviously, they approved it. But, the point is that you get the legislature involved at the very beginning. That way, you don't have a governor out here acting for a long period of time without the legislature being involved. And so for the membership of the legislature, this was a real important piece. We debated on the number of days. I know you recall, and it was in various drafts, any number of days. At one point, it was 2 days. At another point, it was 30 days. At one point, it was 15 days. It was 8 days a couple of times, and so we ultimately settled on 8 days, which I think is probably a fair balance.
Well, it is a point where we can get involved early, but yet if it's, I think of when the governor declared a statewide disaster when the hurricane was rolling in, and the forecasters, fortunately, were wrong. The forecasters were predicting that it was going to have a statewide impact on us as far as tornado outbreaks, flooding, etc. He declared a statewide state of emergency 3-4 days later. That didn't prove out, and so that's part of the reason too. We wanted a safe time, not too soon, but not too late. And that's how we ended up on day 8. All right, I tell you what I'm going to have to do. Jimmy had a limited amount of time today to join me today because when you're in session, you got to take care of family stuff on the weekend. And so what we're going to do, we're going to draw a line on page 5 around line 5, and we'll come back. If Jimmy can join me next Saturday, we'll come back, and hopefully this will have been heard at least in committee this week. You can watch live stream by going up to the state website, find the, and this was assigned to public health. Senate Public Health will be the first place where this will be heard. You can watch the website at www.arcleg.ar.us. Find the Senate Public Health agenda, click on it, and you'll see where it is, and you actually watch the video and the presentation of the bill. But Jimmy, let's try to work it out where you can come back on next Saturday, because this will be about a 2-3 week process getting through the legislature, and we can come back and talk about further details. All right, anything you want to share? Anything you want to share, Jimmy, before you go?
I look forward to seeing this make its way through the legislature and become law. So appreciate all your work on it, and look forward to seeing it through.
Very good. That's Jimmy Gazaway representing Northeast Arkansas around Paragould, that immediate area up there, and appreciate Jimmy. He's the one that Representative Jimmy Gazaway and I have worked on this with support from the governor. Well, I don't say support, involvement from the governor's office, but also involvement from the legislature. So we look forward to seeing it get passed. All right, now we're going to take a quick 1-minute break-ish, and we're going to come back, and we're going to be joined by Carlton Wing, and we're going to talk about some legislation he's got coming down the line that's intended to protect senior adults from fraudulent activity, unfortunately on the rise during this time. So come back and join me with Representative Carlton Wing here on the Kim Hammer Show.
Do you suffer from lower back pain, knee pain, foot pain, plantar fasciitis, arthritis, fallen arches, or neuropathy? If yes, just stop and write this magic word, G-Defy. What is G-Defy? G-Defy is the footwear designed by Gravity Defier Medical Technology with the worldwide patented VersoShock sole. Their shoes are clinically proven to relieve pain by a double-blind clinical study. You can try a pair free for 30 days with free corrective fit orthotic inserts. If you're not satisfied, just return the shoes for a full refund and keep the orthotics. As a gift, save $20 and get free shipping when you go to gdefy.com/radio and use code RADIO. That's gdefy.com/radio. Code RADIO.
Hey, it's Steve from 93.3 The Fish, and I'm a client of Pat Davis, yourhealthplanman.com. I'll be honest, I was skeptical when I first heard Pat talking about getting paid to go to the doctor. Sounded too good to be true. But as I got to know Pat, I decided to put those fears aside, and now I am one of his many very happy clients. I went to the doctor recently. My bill was $76. A few weeks later, I got my bill from the insurance company. It was paid in full, and are you ready for this? I got a check for $180. When was the last time you went to the doctor and couldn't wait to get your bill? This happens all the time with Pat Davis, yourhealthplanman.com. He can put you on a plan all year round. It isn't too good to be true. It's exactly how Pat says it is. Give him a call and see if he can save you 30 to 50 and even more % on your premiums. What an affordable alternative to the Unaffordable Care Act. And best of all, this is health insurance and not just supplemental or a share plan that are not health insurance and have no guarantees. So call Pat today, 501-605-6935. That's 501-605-6935.
101.1 FM. The Answer.
Hey, welcome back to the Kim Hammer Show. The first half had Representative Jimmy Gazaway. We were talking about the emergency powers bill that will be running hopefully this week in the session. You can keep up with it by going to the state website, www.arcleg.ar.us. ar.us. Right now, I've got Representative Carlton Wing. Carlton, thank you for taking a little time out this afternoon to be on the Kim Hammer Show.
Oh, you bet. Honored to be here.
All right, very good. All right, so I noticed that you've got a House bill. I was looking through the list, and I saw a House Bill 1391, and got a little bit of a description off the bill as far as what it's about or the intent. Can you kind of go down in the details of what it's about, because it involves senior citizens, I think, and fraudulent activity, and what your intent is?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, it's a very sad story when you see what is happening to many of our seniors who have worked their entire lives to build a nest egg so that they can retire, so that they can be able to do the things that they always wanted to do, and then even towards the end of their life so that they can get into a quality situation for long-term care. And to see that evaporate as quickly as it happens because of these scams, and they take advantage of the fact that many of these seniors are trusting. They believe what they're hearing, and they get started down this path. And there's sometimes they just get to a point of no return. And so what will happen is these seniors will be told anything from, you've won the lottery. All you need to do is pay the taxes on that lottery, and we're going to send you $20 million or $10 million. So some figure that sounds just great. And so they think, oh, wow, all I have to do is just pay a few $1,000s here or there. And they don't realize that once they get started down that path, there's all these other fees and all these other fees. And they don't realize until it's way too late that they had never won the lottery. This was never part of the deal. They were scammed from the beginning. But it's not just lottery. People will spoof and say they're from the IRS. You owe back taxes if you don't pay something right now over the phone right now. We're gonna send the IRS after you. They'll say that your utility bills, and this particularly happened. We saw an uptick in this during our last cold front. They would call seniors when we were having this very, very cold spell and say, you haven't paid your utility bills. You need to pay it right now over the phone. And, sometimes just a few $100, but that's money that is going to scammers. There's even romance scams. I'm aware of a situation where an older gentleman thought a hot Russian bride was going to come move to Arkansas, and all he needed to do was pay some fees, get her for an airline ticket, and she got to the airport supposedly and said now she needed another $1,000 to get through customs, and it was a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here. There was never a Russian bride. In fact, he would have been very unimpressed with the person that he was conversing with over the phone. But all of those things happen, and then as you mentioned going into the break, it has accelerated during COVID-19, because here's the underlying factor that creates the setting for this is you have someone who might be lonely, who is at home a lot, and so it's kind of a twofold thing. They're already a little bit lonely, and then COVID put everybody under a lockdown socially. So now it's even accelerated, and so they're spending more time on social media. They're spending more time on the phones, and it makes them more susceptible to be exposed to these scammers. And sooner or later, sometimes they just decide to start talking to them. And anytime a senior is talking to somebody on the phone and they're asking for money, and if they ever ask you to go get gift cards at a store, anything like that, that is a scam. Do not do that. And we have been, one of the parts of this is we're trying to expand our outreach. There are a lot of retailers who are aware of this already. But when a retailer sees a senior coming up with $2,000 worth of gift cards, the good ones know to alert somebody, and I'm aware of that happening here in Sherwood. We had somebody at a CVS pharmacy who saw something suspicious and alerted the authorities and was able to get that particular transaction stopped.
Hey, I didn't give you an opportunity. What geographical area do you serve? Sherwood, I think, is primary, but what is your geographical area?
I've got a large part of North Little Rock and a chunk of Sherwood as well. So I'm kind of the north part of North Little Rock and the southern part of Sherwood.
Okay, very good. So do you have, you mentioned, a gentleman, what is it that drove you to get involved in wanting to, because it takes a lot of time to get a piece of legislation like this through. And I mean, it's a pretty thoughtful process. So what is it that motivated you to get involved in this one?
Well, it's personal for me. I had a lady who was she was my Sunday school teacher when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, and a very, very dear woman, and was very influential. And this woman was together. I mean, she had us. She was an Air Force veteran, and she had us in line in Sunday school class. And you can imagine 8, 9, 10-year-old boys, we can get a little rambunctious, but we did not dare cross her. But in the later part, she was retired, and she fell victim to one of these scams. And I worked very, very hard to try to stop that flow. And it was that experience that helped me realize she was not alone, because I had conversations with the Attorney General's office. I had conversations with the FBI, Adult Protective Services under DHS, and I began to see how widespread this is. And so I have put together a task force that has been meeting for the last few weeks with all of those entities: FBI, DHS, Adult Protective Services, the Attorney General's office, also the Bankers Association. A lot of people don't realize that it's the bankers who realize before just about anybody else that there's a problem. And but some laws prohibit them from being able to properly and appropriately raise their hand and say, hey, we've got an issue here. So we're going to address that. We've got some legislation. We're meeting again this week. We've been meeting every week. And within the next week or so, we'll be able to put down some comprehensive legislation that will protect our seniors and give the people who see these problems arising early the ability to say so. And another interesting statistic in this is it's about 50-50 between the scammers are either strangers that are typically from Jamaica or Nigeria that are offshore somewhere, but the other half are the caregivers. And family members will take advantage of a situation in which a senior is maybe starting to lose a little bit of their mental acuity, and can be taken advantage of fairly easly. That will happen quite a bit as well. And it's tragic. It's heartbreaking because it's close to home when that happens. But it does happen. And so we need to protect these people who have lived their entire lives in a very responsible and methodical way, living beneath their means so that they could store for their later years, and then to see hundreds of thousands of dollars disappear from their accounts in fairly short order, and now they're left penniless. It is tragic.
All right. Good work. And if you need some help on the Senate end, let me know. I'll be glad to help you on the Senate end. All right. That's going to be House Bill 1391 that you want to follow through, especially if you have parents that are senior adult age, or you feel that they're in a vulnerable population. That'll be an important one for you to follow through on House Bill 1391. That's being crafted and being driven by Representative Carlton Wing, who represents Sherwood and the immediate proper area around Sherwood. All right, one last question for you before you go. Anybody ever told you got a voice for radio or TV?
I've heard that occasionally. I do that with my other career. So I do a lot of outdoor shows, hunting and fishing shows, nationally on the World Fishing Network and Sportsman Channel, and we even had a local show here called FLW Arkansas. And many moons ago, I was a sportscaster on Channel 4.
Very good. I remember those moons many moons ago. So
those
all
were
right.
Fun times.
Carlton, I'll look forward to seeing you at the Capitol next week. And seriously, if you need help on 1391 on the Senate end, let me know. I'll be glad to help you. That's a good cause, and appreciate you watching out for our senior citizens. All right, that was Carlton Wing. Now, next up on the Kim Hammer Show, I've got John Martin, who is the owner of the Bryant Pharmacy, or Family Pharmacy down in Bryant, and also John Vincent, who is the president of the Pharmacists Association here in Arkansas. Gentlemen, thank you all for taking a few minutes to join me on the Kim Hammer Show.
Hey, good afternoon, Kim. It's good to see you. Good to hear from you.
All right. Hey, John, first of all, Martin, tell folks where your pharmacy is down there in Bryant, so they just have a geographical idea where you're located.
Yes, sir. Yeah, we're on the corner. We're actually on Highway 5, just up from the corner of Spring Hill Road and Highway 5. If you're familiar with Bryant, we're right in between Mary's Place and the Polaris dealership, Bryant Polaris on Highway 5.
Yeah, you're getting a brand new 4-lane with a middle turn lane driveway in the front of your business, aren't you?
Yes, sir. We're full-fledged in the middle of construction on the highway out there in front, for sure.
All right, and you're a member of the Arkansas CPESN network. What exactly is the CPESN network?
Yes, sir. It's an enhanced services network for community pharmacists in the state and across the country. Really, there's thousands of pharmacies across the country that offer these enhanced services that go a little bit above and beyond just your normal everyday filling of prescriptions. We're part of that network.
Is that made up of independent pharmacists only, or is that big box and all of the above type pharmacies?
So it's independent pharmacies, as far as I know. John, are there any other big box pharmacies in the network?
We've also had some participation from Kroger and other states and Harps. I know you're familiar with Dwayne Jones here in Arkansas from the Harps small grocery chain up in Northwest Arkansas. They've got about 30 stores in our state. And in fact, Dwayne Jones is the current chair of the board for the group. There's 136 locations in Arkansas. It's a very large network. It's actually, if you were thinking of them as a chain of independent pharmacies, they're actually larger than Walmart. Walmart has about 125 pharmacies. So it's a really diverse, geographically diverse group of pharmacists that go above and beyond the fill.
So is being a member of that network have any relationship to the COVID vaccine that's going on, or how are those two connected any at all?
They are. This network actually is one of a couple of dozen federal partners with the Trump administration and now with the Biden administration. And the network of pharmacies has about 7 states who are receiving vaccine through the federal allocation. And Arkansas CPSN was chosen as one of those states because of the high opportunity in our state. A lot of people who are in poverty, a lot of people who may not speak English as a first language, may have housing issues. It's called a social vulnerability index. And so there's a lot of need in our state and a lot of people with a high risk of death from COVID. They chose our state. They began to send about 10,000 doses last week to our state, and our network is going to get about almost 23,000 doses of vaccine next week. So a really good spot to be in, ironically, to have on the one hand, it's bad to have a higher risk of bad outcomes from COVID, but on the silver lining of that, the federal government recognizes our need, and this group of independent pharmacies are going to help meet that need.
So 23,000 additional doses that would be coming in next week?
Yes, on top of the state's allocation. So it's going to push our weekly allocation, at least for next week, up close to 100,000 doses, which is about 3 times as many as our state was receiving about 3 weeks ago. So really good news. Not every pharmacy or every provider is going to get access to those vaccines, but as we've moved into the 65-plus population, that's really going to help to finish out the 70 and above, the 65-plus, and the educators in the next 3 weeks.
So let me ask you, John, John Martin I'm going to have to call you by last names to keep you all separated, but so John Martin, what's your role in how this is all going to impact what you're able to do as a local pharmacist there in Bryant?
Sure. So, the limiting factor to vaccinating the state has really been the supply of vaccine into the state. So being able to get doses via this other mechanism, kind of diversifying where we're getting vaccine from, really enables us to vaccinate the state faster. It gives us more opportunity to do larger events, to get more people vaccinated. And it also allows the state to kind of diversify where some of those vaccines are going. We can utilize different mechanisms from different different federal programs versus the state getting their allocation, and really allow us to kind of go at that those groups, the 65 plus and the educators, and really get them done faster to make it where it's moving to 1C even faster than what we were before.
So let me ask you, and like last week, First Methodist down in Benton had an event where they had a group of their senior adults, or they had organized an event where vaccinations were able to be given. the rhyme and the reason to the distribution and what local entities could do to help get these vaccinations out quicker, because that is good news, John. With 23,000 additional doses coming into the state next week, that is huge when you consider the total number. But rhyme or reason, how can local entities in a community participate with the pharmacists in order to get the vaccinations done quicker without maybe jumping ahead of somebody that's already had their name on the list at their pharmacy to get their shot? How does all that work out?
Yeah, sure. So there's several different mechanisms. I know for us at Bryant Family, we've got a list. We've got appointments scheduled for people, and we're not necessarily jumping the line. We're not letting anybody jump in front of anyone else. Typically, what we've done in the past is we've kind of created separate groups. We worked with school districts in Wing County, several weeks ago, and kind of created a separate group for them. That we started 70 plus, went through them for a week, had a weekend set up where we went and just vaccinated the educators, and then came back to the 70 plus population. So that was kind of an example of the time that we utilized our vaccine to go at two different groups at once, right? And really, organizing some of these larger scale events or specific to different locations, we're able to, pull those people off of our list and then maybe shorten our lists by doing that.
So what would you advise as far as if you're a pastor of a church or you maybe have a civic organization, would you just want them to contact the local pharmacist and say, hey, can we work together to coordinate an effort to where we would host it at our site? Because one thing I would see that would be unfortunate is if you went to the effort to do that, and then let's say the number of vaccines wasn't available and you advertise this event just to the general population. Is that good or bad, or is that even a worry to be concerned about?
Well, so for us, and I know most of the pharmacies across the state, we're utilizing an appointment-based model. So we're making appointments that correspond to the number of vaccine doses that we have. That's enabled us to make sure that we're administering the number of doses that we've got. So we're not making too many appointments. We're not having too many people show up for an event and not have enough vaccine for everybody. And it also enables us to make sure that we're still following, the social distancing and making sure that we don't have too many people gathered in one area at one time. We found that to be really successful when we did the teacher event here a few weeks ago. We were able to, schedule those teachers to be there over the course of 4 hours. We did 1,200 vaccinations over the course of 4 hours, and we're able to keep everybody away, socially distant from each other. By using that appointment-based. And we also were able to, like I said, schedule exactly the number of vaccines that we had for those teachers. And that kind of creates, a windfall both ways, in that we're not, promising more than what we can deliver, but then we're also, creating a way to administer these vaccines in an orderly process.
All right. You're listening to the Kim Hammer Show. My guests at this time are John Martin, who is the owner of the Bryant Family Pharmacy down in Bryant, and John Vincent, who is the president of the Arkansas Pharmacists Association. So Johnson & Johnson is now, they are now going to be able to release their vaccine. If I remember right, that gives us a total of 3 pharmaceutical companies that have 3 different vaccines out there. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes, that is accurate.
Okay. So, and the thing that amazes me is that 3 different companies putting out 3 different vaccines, all directed towards taking care of the COVID. How is it that any one of them are any better than the other, or how is it that we need 3 different ones? And is there, say I show up and I say, well, I don't want the Johnson & Johnson one, I want the other one, or how do you address that issue, or is that even a concern?
So we've seen a little bit of that, just in that some patients want. Right now, we currently have Moderna and Pfizer that are available in the state, and we've had some issues where patients, prefer one over the other. ultimately, you know, they're very similar in their efficacy against the virus. So, you know, most patients, when presented with, you know, choosing one over the other, they're okay with the one that we currently have available. We've had a few patients that have said, well, I really would prefer this other, in which case we try to find them a pharmacy that has that vaccine available for them to go to get administered at. You know, I think that the big thing with having more players into the game as far as the number of vaccine companies is that that's ultimately going to contribute to us being able to have more vaccine into the state, right? So kind of that same thing where I was talking about, you know, the state having their allocation of vaccine and then having different federal partners that are able to get more vaccine in the state. Having a third manufacturer really just adds more vaccine into the state. And ultimately, you know, the end goal was to get everybody vaccinated. So anything that we can do to have more vaccine in the state to be able to administer more is a win.
I've got about 3 or 4 minutes. Talk about the numbers. How many vaccines, give me the number, John, as we talk about this from time to time. How many total vaccines have been sent into the state? How many have actually been administered? What's our percentage now?
So thank you for that question. So the state has received 950,000 doses as of yesterday at 3:58 p.m., and they have administered both through the Walgreens CVS federal program and the state program and other federal doses coming in, 659 of those doses. And the percentage on that is right at 64% have been administered. And as we've talked before, now that we've gotten past the snowstorm, they're still able to crank out and administer over 90% of all first doses coming in within 48 hours of them arriving. So the vast majority of those doses that aren't administered yet are second doses that are scheduled for appointments over the next week. So they come in a few days before those scheduled appointments, and they can't be given until the date of the appointment because you have to wait 21 days or 28 days at a minimum in between the first dose and the second dose for Pfizer and Moderna. So I think we're doing really well. There's actually a Twitter feed now